Maria Schreiber. I'm the director of this thing called DIE. And most people you see here are students. Most of them not living, or actually none of them living in Arnhem, but arriving here on Mondays, once per month, for a full week of seminars, tutorials, workshops, discussions. Anyway, each evening we present, this week at least, we present a lecture or presentation by an invited guests. To you it may seem that there is no connection between all these lectures, but actually they are part of projects and seminars that run also throughout the day. So tonight we have a lecture that is interesting for all of us, but is actually embedded in a project we call How to Do Things with Theory, which is curated and tutored by Elena Alexandrova, Marina Vishnik, and Bassam Albaroni. All of them also always coming to Arnhem from wherever they live for this 1 week to put up this place of meeting, of reflection. And I'm very happy to give the floor to Bassam, who will introduce tonight's talk. Okay.
Good evening, everybody. Tonight's talk is by Mohammed Salami, who is a thinker and the curator based in New York, via Vancouver, via Iran also. And Mohammed's talk tonight is, I've been following Mohammed's work for quite some time, and I eventually met him in Los Angeles last autumn, and he gave an excellent presentation in a symposium that was curated by one of my favorite artists and theoreticians, Amanda Beach, who's also part of the course that I'm teaching here. And Mohammed's presentation is somehow linked to the notion of exit. One could say exit from contemporary art propagated by theorists such as Suhail Malik, except that it has its own driver, so to speak, in that he's using scientific philosophy, or philosophy of science, mainly Wilfrid Sellars, to interrogate contemporary art and its use of the image. And I won't say much more, and I'll leave Mohammed to it. I'm very happy to have him here tonight.
Thank you, Bassam. Also, thanks to Dutch Art Institute for inviting me over to do this presentation. Before I get into the actual paper, I just wanted to sort of like, it's like in the beginning of the TV show when you go like previously, and then they show some like previous stuff. There's a little bit of it, like, this is basically what we sort of like achieved last fall in Los Angeles, when Amanda had invited us for a curatorial conference. Basically, sort of like problematizing what is the problem with art. Oh yeah, with art, which is the problem is contemporary art. But the problem of art is contemporary art, and how to deal with it, right? So all sorts of like critiques, right? I'm gonna just like read them like in point form, right? Like basically like the obsession of contemporary art with present and presencing. centering around the artist stars, but not even in a form of like a rigorous science of astronomy, but more like astrology of stars, which kind of like weird things happen, right? Contemporary art propping up the art for all sorts of purposes other than what the official organs of contemporary art claim contemporary art to be about. And the main philosophical function of art to still be to verify the existence of the individuated subjectivity of human and its centrality to the whole project of like civilization. And building on the historical function of art as the space for the cultivation and practice of this ideal humanity. Another unchanged function of art to carry meaning, or worse, to produce meaning. Like in all sorts of ways, like psychologically, historically, phenomenologically, affectually, however you want to like describe this meaning or categorize the meaning. And also, as far as my research is concerned, propping up art as always being outside of the cybernetic paradigm that we're all sort of like part of, and kind of like to reflect from, and these days with like the practices such as, I don't want to name artists, and like post-internet and all that, sort of like commenting on internet and computation from this outside space, sort of like, and sort of like finding this as a new sort of like venue to legitimize art as like we produce real stuff, real objects. We don't deal with this kind of digital stuff, and that actually gives us not only a place to give you legitimate real things, but to reflect on the ontology of the digital or ontology of this cybernetic thing that's like taken over the globe. So these were the sort of stuff that we discussed, and then the paper that I'm reading is sort of like starts there and kind of like gets into a new territory, or like newer stuff. It's all related. So unlike the modern age when scientific and artistic authorities, or in other words, the concepts and practices associated with objectivity and subjectivity were carried out by humans and typically embodied in concrete artifacts, today the materiality of human knowledge and experience, meaning the credibility of its past, the reality of its present, and the probability of its future, are determined to a great extent by the gathering and sharing, as well as algorithmic processing and visualization of data into information and information into knowledge. Pushing network computers beyond the living archive, algorithms are increasingly involved in more than just capturing, sorting, and parsing data. They have begun to take part in the processes of thinking, deciding, as well as making and enforcing rules, activities long conceived to be exclusive to humans. The emergence of this new integrated space and engine of navigation and productivity is enabling a new kind of collaborative production of knowledge by a large number of humans and machines. This new space of productivity is expanding and revising its own outlines through persistent and collective human-machine interaction, blurring the lines between what it is to be a human and/or a machine. This gradual symbiosis of humans and technology is swallowing everything, leaving behind nothing but two separate, skeuomorphic empty shells we call the individual and technology, only to be still misrecognized by our sense perception as two separate things. This misrecognition keeps fueling our needless anxiety about the possibility of the integration of humans and machines, or the emergence of artificial intelligence, which, in my opinion, both have already taken place and must indeed be situated in the past. Every day, it is becoming more clear that not only we are already one with our machines, but that perhaps it is possible to scientifically and functionally think of humans and nature as complex machines. The integration of these two complex systems, meaning the natural world and the human-made technologies via the medium of cybernetics, is essentially erasing the categorical differences between the object and subject, thought and image, as well as depth and surface, eventually rendering obsolete the need for such things as culture, nature, perhaps even science, philosophy, and art. As the consequences of the cybernetic age for planetary life is being somewhat addressed in specific fields, the ramifications of the mass redistribution of labor between humans and machines, and the symbiosis of nature and technology has yet to be properly reflected upon. Meanwhile, even less is being said about what are the implications of these tectonic shifts for the future of art. Defining the relationship of art to technology has never been an easy task, often resulting either in their conflation or their imaginary opposition. Of course, art is a form of technology, but one in which historically the physical and the semantic resources of the tool are mobilized to reinforce the being of the humans in opposition to both nature and machines. Art, up until our time, has essentially functioned as a humanist technology. It utilizes non-human means and machines in order to reflect on the human condition as the center from which the universe can be evaluated, a sort of human veneration machine that even when it is questioning anthropocentrism or anthropomorphism, it perpetuates the existence of the distinct category of humans through its celebration. Meanwhile, the technological transformations of the last few decades and the consequences for the realm of culture are starting to threaten the exclusivity of humans' conscious and embodied experience of the world, which functions concretely through their relationship with the world of appearances in general and art as its most prestigious product. However, while the last stages of the age of cybernetics has more or less failed to mean much to art, the explosion of network, digital, and algorithmic knowledge has begun to slowly erode art's place, not only in the larger context of social life, but even in its historically secure position as the oracle of all creativity. What sets out contemporary condition apart from the past is how various human-centered or mediated epistemologies are not just shifting, but declining and giving way to a new paradigm in which not only images and art, but also the whole physical universe can potentially be approached and understood as functions or processes which are ultimately invisible to human perception. Today, not only science, but even art and culture can be measured, studied, even judged with little physical and no metaphysical connections to humanity's understanding of the world, which often is based solely on the meaning and implications drawn from a needless sophistication of human sense perception and historical experience. Because the enabling condition for art's existence has historically been the exceptionality of humans and their exclusive right to observing and understanding the world, the synthesis of humans and machines bring with it a profound identity crisis, which can only be addressed through a return to the drawing board and beginning from zero, which I regard to be the very definition of art. To go back to the very definition of art. The conflict between our machines as a direct descendant of sciences and our conception of humanity as the historical legacy of humanities is not unlike the tensions between what philosopher of science Wilfred Sellars has characterized as a scientific and the manifest image. For those who are not familiar with Sellars' categories of the manifest and scientific image, these idealized conceptions are two distinct modes for the production of composite knowledge, two distinct but enjoined ways for understanding humanity and the world. Sellars describes the manifest image as the conceptual framework in terms of which human beings, based on their understanding of the observable world, first came to be aware of themselves as human in the world. He then qualifies his description by adding that this image, which throughout the course of human history has become more sophisticated, is both a historical and a methodological fiction, and therefore can be considered scientific in a very limited sense, and only in the manifest image's own terms. Far from the world of the appearances, the scientific image, itself another idealization, is composed through postulating of imperceptible entities to explain the behavior of perceptible things. An integration of a manifold of images, each of which is the application to man of a framework of concepts which have a certain autonomy. To quote Sellars directly, for each scientific theory is, from the standpoint of methodology, a structure which is built at a different place and by different procedures within the intersubjectively accessible world of perceptible things. Thus, the scientific image is a construct from a number of images, each of which is supported by the manifest world. So like you can think of like how like this idealized thing called the scientific image is sort of like the simplified and like very crude way of describing it is how if you can lens together how biology and physics and neuroscience and chemistry, each at a different level, look at an object or look at a problem, and how you can telescope this together if you can. And that would be sort of like a closest thing as a crude example of what a scientific image is. Yet when we turn our attention to the scientific image, which emerges from the several images proper to the several sciences, we note that although the image is methodologically dependent on the world of sophisticated common sense, and in this sense does not stand on its own feet, yet it purports to be a complete image. Thus, although methodologically a development within the manifest image, the scientific image presents itself as a rival image to the manifest image. From its point of view, the manifest image on which it rests, the manifest image is inadequate, but pragmatically useful likeliness of a reality which first finds its adequate likeliness in a scientific image. So it's an inadequate, but a necessity. Like, this is not about saying like manifest image needs to be replaced or destroyed, but it's about placing it in relation to a larger picture whose existence can only be situated within the manifest image, because after all, we're human. Sellars is relevant to our discussion, not only because of the content of his thought, but also as a result of a surge of interest in his philosophical contributions by new rationalist, functionalist, and accelerationist thinkers and philosophers. In fact, one can argue that transformations in the production of knowledge as a result of the ramifying path the cybernetic revolution has taken in the last 5 decades are not disconnected from why contemporary thinkers like Ray Brazier, Reza Negarestani, Peter Wolfendale, and others are showing interest in Sellars' work. Thus, by bringing him into our discussion, we are making the link between Sellars and the age of cybernetic more explicit. But that's not it. Sellars, in this historical conjuncture, is also relevant to the discussion surrounding the problems of contemporary art in the age of mass cybernetics. His concepts heightens the conflict between the two categories for being an agent of proliferation for both the manifest and the scientific image. In other words, while on the manifest surface of our culture, network computers have straightened the perceptual and correlational connections of humans to the world, in reality, advancement in science and scientific thinking enabled by computers are eroding the foundations of our real relationship to the world. So that's the sort of like a contradiction, right? On the surface, it looks like these things are reconfirming our existence as humans, social networking, blah, 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 right? But in reality, this very same things that through which the image of man in the world is being reinforced and reinscribed is being undermined by the type of scientific methodologies that computers have enabled, like to scientists, you know. After all, computers used to be a scientific tool before they became popularized and became like an everyday use, right? If you look at it, computers were like military scientific, and then they kind of became office work, and then they kind of became like a popular tool. And in a sort of like, if you want to look at how this popularization or democratization of computer technologies kind of took place between like 1950s to now. In light of this widening gap between the image of our place in the world and its reality, it is indispensable and therefore necessary to reconcile the human perspective with the scientist's aperspectival description of the world. A concertization, which in my opinion is a precondition for genuine agency. I'd say concertization or harmonization, because if the manifest image is completely replaced by the alien viewpoint of sciences in regulating our behavior, not only we would not be persons and could not engage in such activities as moral behavior or even scientific research, but also the kind of machinic subjectivities we are co-establishing with and for our artificial intelligence for the future will lack the basic ethics of being in the world. So but basically, I'm arguing that we can't eliminate a manifest image because ultimately, that's the world we're gonna like live for our robots, and we want robots to be part of what we know being in the world means or has meant to us for the last few thousand years. This is why Sellars call for a stereoscopic vision which harmonizes the descriptive resources of the sciences with the language of humanity and community intentions can help us transcend not only the dualism of the manifest and scientific image, but also that of the human and the machine. Perhaps this is why the creation of the Sellarsian stereoscopic vision has to deal with art and the question of the image, both as an obstacle to this unity, but also as a potential space for its enactment. For art to make sense after the machine, it needs to be something other than what it has been. And the place to reconsider a new art is as much the world of thought as is the artist studio. So in this respect, I'll continue my talk with a text which I've been constructing out of several online conversations I've had with a group of artists and philosophers in relation to what it means to make and exhibit art in the future. If we begin by the assumption that art has always existed and what we are trying to do is to explain it, then of course we have to create a concept of art that fits the set of existing artworks. But if you begin by developing a concept of art as a condition to understand whether a new kind of art exists or is possible, then we could very well simply find out that today much of what is taken to be art simply isn't. If we are to hang on to anything that might be called or resemble art, our efforts have to be part of how we come to understand not only what art is, but also what art does and what it is ought to do. We must remember that there is always a pendular movement between art's impact on knowledge, or in other words, its capacity to make knowledge cognizable, and both the theoretical and aesthetic blindness of sciences, which supposedly produce knowledge. Art, if considered as a rationality that has a particular way of accessing and manipulating the outer form and materials, is then a type of technology in relation to the solutions for epistemological shortcomings for which sciences have no patience. Art must function for both the human and machine as a membrane between these two seemingly separate but at the same time integrated entities. The interface that makes humans available to machines and machines available to humans. A kind of symbolic semantic structure that in the absence of direct mind-machine integration relates the historical significance of our culture to its future function via the technologized being. Solutions to the problem of our human-centered art are strictly non-trivial. Removing subjective and therefore diverse interpretation or experience of art as its condition or telos can collapse the entire edifice of art paradigm. However, the problem of the existing human-centered art is not just with its interpretation, but also with the relaxation of epistemic standards for education of its value, and more so the function of art through which the value of an artistic proposal is gauged, only relatively to the artistic act with which it is affirmed. Therefore, the art's problem cannot be solved at the level of viewing and interpreting, because the conceptual import of interpretive practices aren't something that would merely follow correlationally from the viewer's confrontation with the produced work of art, but also must involve the kind of thinking that would make a work of art possible in the first place. The second thing involves artists. At the level of production, the artist, be it a human or a machine, not only utilizes techniques in the larger sense of the term, but also enough fidelity to maintain certain assumptions in order to organize the functional hierarchies of the work, while predicting how a cognitive manifold generates assumptions about the work's metaphysics and its availability to the viewer. This type of work, as far as the machine side is concerned, is not much different than how algorithmic high-speed trading works. I don't know if you guys know how high-speed algorithm works, right? It's like, well, it's like they're algorithms that are basically process historical data on how market behavior, both sort of like geographically, temporally, throughout the day, throughout the month, throughout the year, how a particular stock has acted historically, and then viewing how actors are acting in the moment, in the trading seat, right? As they're acting that moment, sort of crunching this historical data with what's available from things that just became past, like a few seconds ago, and crunching this and coming up with sort of like some sort of like taking risk in terms of guessing what the next step should be. And then diversifying the risk by looking at the opposite of all those data and sort of like hedging some of it in the opposite. So if the decision itself, the risk that was taken was not really like great, this other stuff, which is the opposite of it, will somehow cover it, right? This is and then all of this has to happen in a very short period of time. That's why being very close to the center of where all these decisions are made is very important, or paying like thousands of dollars for like high-speed cables to where the high-speed traders are sitting is very important, because time becomes a matter of like billions of dollars, right? So this is sort of like that. That's why I use the example, because the type of relationship artists, I think, is a good example for the way you think of outcomes when you're thinking of, when an artist wants to think of art making. And I don't want to use the word like production of meaning, or because it's either production of meaning or production of career or production of something, right? So you can just put all that together and call it outcome, right? Whatever outcome you're hoping to get with this, right? So like this is sort of like what the example I could come up with in terms of how you situate the agency of the artist in art production in relation to outcome. This is why human creation does not have value by itself. To simply say any act of creative affirmation by humans is good in itself is precisely what allows the relativist everything is art to never self-exhaust. Making art must involve responding to the problem of enablement. How does making work of art enable one to think? Art production cannot be merely formal play. If this was the case, we could always frame whatever that is being produced by humans or machines as art and call it art, just like basically ready-made, right? Who wants art? You have ready-made. Just light it good and it's art. Formalization and formal, as Ben Woodard reminded us earlier on, this is sort of like, this relates to, I'm really sorry, I'm getting a message. Really sorry. I'm gonna go back to, everything is not confused. I'm really sorry, just give me 1 sec. So formalization and form. At the same time, that is not a formal play. Thinking rigorously about formalization and form, and having fidelity in one's ability to work with constraints set by genre and form, right? So this is a different approach to form, because it doesn't come from how far you can stretch the form, but it's how constraints set by form can actually produce something valuable. And I'm going to explain it more. Have far more import than pure play and experimentation with form. If anything, the formation of art, rather than being playful in relation to form, needs to be approached as a strategy of both gaming the cognoscensible surface of the work as well as that of the viewership. The idea of having conceptual and rational demands from art is simply to say that whatever value artworks can be taken to have cannot simply reside in a conceptually indeterminate notion of interpretation, totally on the side of the subjective act of viewing, without concerning the productive intentions of the maker, which must always be worn like an identity tag by art on its sleeve. This is a fine balance, of course, to make the function of the work executable on the level of the surface without succumbing to correlational anthropo trap loops. On the level of consumption or the viewership, The social aspect of art operates according to certain normative limitations itself. While art is produced according to the constraints set by the spatial and material limitations which informs its appearance, these physical constraints neither equate but nor function differently than the normative social context of art. They equally constrain or form art into shape. So from one side, limitations of the studio, material, working in the studio, and from the other, limitations of the social dimension, which is like, oh my God, what do people think about this? Where is it going to be shown? And how that viewership kind of like puts it in form, right? These two types of constraint equally constrain or form art into its shape. This is why the art part of art happens in an operation that crisscrosses both the material level of production and the social normative production in order for art to reasonably assert new rules, or as others might want to say, have any meaning. Exiting the existing art should also mean abandoning the ontological status of the artwork as a sacred and collectible object. The dissatisfaction is that there's almost nothing new left to say or do, yet art just habitually assumes, like religion or politics, its monopoly on certain kinds of social value and function. In this regard, there's also a fundamental distinction to be made between two senses of art. The general sense, which includes all human activities aimed at something like beauty or unconditional value, including all various mediums and their historical assertions, like not just sculpture and painting and installation, but like literature, cinema, video games, poetry, all sorts of other forms of creativity aimed at the question of beauty or unconditional value. And then so that on one side, this general sense on one side, and then the more specific sense of art that identifies a practice that will be opposed to something like literature, perhaps as the creation and cultivation of certain site-specific encounters in gallery. So basically the art, like what we call art, or what they used to call visual arts, right? When most people talk about the definition of art, they're talking about the latter, meaning the gallery art, or like contemporary art, or art we call art. The limited definition of art as that which is visual and based in galleries and museums, of course, has got little more than historical inertia holding together the actual practice of art, which is why it invites the relativist wisdom of curators and critics, since it presumes to articulate a motley of practices that seem radically variegated in content, but secretly joined in where things really count. The definition that privileges the optical and plastic arts, despite being newer, actually essentializes the historical incident of modern art, and through musology and photography, these two amazing 19th century technologies, projects itself in the mirror of history to bounce back and be legitimated as what we call art history. So the legitimacy of visual art or modern art and later on contemporary art comes from the fact that the technologies of photography and musology allowed modern art in its conception in late 19th century to kind of like go back and study the past and kind of build a narrative back to itself and claim itself to be the art of all arts and separate itself from the rest of the fields of art and kind of claim the word of art for itself away from music, poetry, and other forms of art, which until 19th century were sort of like more in line with each other, right? And I think photography played a major role in that because all works of art found a new meaning once cameras were sent to like all European sites and paintings were photographed and brought back to be studied. In fact, there's a correlation between the rise of photography and the rise of art history as a discipline. These two are totally correlate and they're all at the same time. Art historians kind of became rigorous when photography made the study of art available and possible. And these two histories are kind of like, nobody has actually done a kind of work to examine this, but it's one of these ideas that I think is worth putting time into, of like the germination of art history as a rigorous, I mean, art history existed from like much longer, right? From Renaissance on, people were writing about, but the rigorous art history or the scientific art history, which was part of academia, is like, begins in like late 19th century with Vienna School and Riegel and people like Aby Warburg and all that were the second generations of it, right? It all happens when photography becomes available. There's something of the laboratory to the gallery that then imbues work of art with a meta quality of occurring in these sorts of secular cathedrals that then gets confused with what is identified as the general qualities of general art, which is like general art being all the other categories of art, and lays claims to them. Whereas the attempt to understand the latter through the lens of the former ends up raising the question of how there is this unifying quality in lieu all sorts of white cube-based distortions. That's not to say we couldn't work out a better definition, but in many ways, this historical inertia in the 20th century and onwards is constituted by the practice's own obsession with its own definition and transgression from its historical definition towards no other goal than the idea of transgressing this history, which combined with the postmodern obsession with difference, diversity, multiplicity, causes nothing but what Sohail Malik calls the indeterminacy of contemporary art. That is what has reduced art practice to this redundancy of affirmative creation when the transgression to any definition becomes the singular obsession. You soon are led to the idea that the only rule is to impose your own will over any set constraint. So that in the end, art is supposed to be understood as an abrupt intervention whose authority and value is endowed directly from its creation. Although it is in fact indexed to its occurring within the confines of this very particular history of practice and practice of history that art finds its meaning. Does this circular redundancy leave us with the horror of trying to come up with a new identity for art or to continue to unite these non-visual types or to unite these non-visual types of activity with the visual ones? Or would it be more fruitful to disentangle them and leave them on their own? Or would it be more fruitful to not disentangle them and just leave them on their own, since unifying them also ends up leading to a sense of exclusivity that still separates them out from scientific and philosophical knowledge, missing their continuity, or at least link them with whatever other sort of activity that is out there. As an important injunction, we have to avoid the vulgar equation between art and science, like the bubonic plague. Today's art has no direct epistemic effects, or if it does, they are contingent. Despite its grand money-producing claims, the art of today is not about a direct production of knowledge. The only way to recuperate visual art is through preventing it from masquerading as the representative of all other arts or forms of creativity, including design. The naivety of the machinic art can be very helpful in this regard. Visual art, as it operates today, has to be understood in terms of its status of a species of some wider genus and should not be allowed to index itself to some historical singularity consisting of constant ontological evolution by art professionals via the ritual of definition refusal or refusing definition. Yes, of course, in a limited sense, a contemporary art installation can provide an experience which triggers a particular reflection, so it can be engineered to maybe produce certain beliefs or assert certain social norms, but this already sounds quite depressing and 20th century. Art should really not be about the production of this type of engineered knowledge, but the discontinuity of the art of knowledge with the knowledge of art can certainly be conserved in a higher category of navigation between art and knowledge, producing a stereoscopic image, much like the Salarsian overlapping of the scientific and the manifest image. Art needs to be understood in terms of its intended and unintended cognitive role, and even perhaps its contingent socio-cognitive role. Therefore, it can be integrated within the Reza Negaristan's navigational paradigm of knowledge from the angle, not from the conceptually dead ends produced by artists who try to justify the value of art by comparing it to the use value of science in terms of the production of a special kind of general philosophical knowledge. This path leads nowhere but down the enchanting humanist romanticism stream one more time. We also ought to have a deflationary attitude towards what knowledge is and why is knowledge valued, rather than saying art produces no knowledge whatsoever. So, because by saying art doesn't produce knowledge, then all of a sudden knowledge becomes this other thing that is like super cool. But knowledge itself needs to be somehow downgraded from this sort of like high status. As long as we understand that art produces no objective knowledge, we can understand how its cognitive trajectory is not the kind of interrogation carried forth by natural sciences. Of course, some artistic practices want to claim to be doing the labor of social sciences, for that matter, by using the results of these types of knowledge productions in their own production. Artists as historian, artists as archivist, artists as social scientists, artists as anthropologists, etc. There's a lot of practices like that, right? However, if we don't take knowledge as the key term, but recognize beauty or a dialectical game involving some kind of plus or minus symmetry proportion between knowledge and beauty as they relate to the surface, then there is a different line of compatibility and a form of science available to art that really science has not been and will not be concerned with. Thus, as far as aesthetics are concerned, an objective knowledge of surface effects is produced by art to different degrees. This shallowing of art is needed if we want our machines to enter its water and learn how to swim. Think the look and feel of fictional worlds and the aesthetics of social insights and interactions, areas in which machines have been an active partner as humans. But even then, art should not be understood simply as that which directly produces this sort of quasi-useful knowledge. Instead, what art can do is to facilitate access to knowledge for both humans and machines. This does not mean that, for example, by providing a photographic record, one can present social issues, or that an installation can help us better understand proportion and spatio-temporal orientation in a human scale. But at a higher level, art can provide us with modes of knowledge compression in the form of form. A good metaphor for this is the QR code, or the good old barcode. Spatio-temporal limitations are not always limitations. Optical and audio effects between the cosmos, habitats, and the living organisms have always been wireless and quite effective in aiding life in moving along its path. However, this compressive role of art must essentially be understood in terms of its role in cognitive process and not elevated as a production of a special kind of supercognitive luxury product. With its indirect and silent method of speaking, art can help us understand the subtle differences between the categories of insight and knowledge. This way, art, like good philosophy, is no longer the knowledge of something, but knowledge of how to do something. The end of an artwork can be to help cement a functional cognitive product, more real than a belief, i.e., an action. The artwork itself is not the knowledge, but it can be the medium to produce knowledge. Art, either as an object or process, can at the end be a facilitator of the process of knowledge production and not the product of the knowledge. An ability rather than a belief. The ability to conceive and move rather than adherence to or endorsement of a conception. Hence, art can be vaguely considered a type of cognitive-philosophical modeling and navigation. The ability to comport intelligence, be it machinic or human, or both in different ways, through the material capacities of the object or the temporal dimensions of the process of making and showing art. The idea of art as insight and navigation rather than knowledge and belief might also be thought of as art of epistemic orientation. Therefore, what is correct to say is not that art is not involved in the production of knowledge, but rather that the production of knowledge is not what constitutes an artwork as an artwork. Even as a thing of beauty, art has a cognitive role and should not be thought of as a cognitive product, which again does suggest a continuity and not interchangeability with science. In a way, only the artwork that incidentally produces direct knowledge is good work of art. And that true art can't be good or even produce knowledge if that is if that is its direct aim. On the other hand, a scientific theory can be artistic, but it can't be good scientific theory if being artistic is what it aims to do. Since what it aims to do is to produce knowledge. The bad end of either the production of knowledge or science effectively is a spectrum that begins with nonsense and ends in propaganda. In this regard, art's position then is similar to philosophy. It operates like an enabling condition for the production of knowledge. But since art isn't just a work of art or the object which produces the effect, and since, as we outlined earlier, it is also shaped by a set of normative social practices, thus art's infatuation with its own changing definition is extremely tied to its interminate subjective effects amongst any number of potential viewers. But this is hardly the result of how the social domain participates in the formation of art. In other words, the sociability of art is less responsible than its material production by the artist for this ineffective indeterminacy. Because usually people who argue the indeterminacy of art, what often results is like the audiences are blamed for indeterminacy, because you think, oh, indeterminacy is caused by so many people getting into the room and curator telling them, oh, all of you guys are right. Art means everything you all want to say. But actually, the seeds of this type of approach to art is already sown in the studio by the artist. And as artists can change the way they approach art making, the social dimension of the production of art can itself be productive in sort of like putting art back on some form of determinate track, if that's one like me is interested in. The future art can synchronize its material normative commitments with commitments in its social domain, and so begins to render concrete and determinate judgments upon art, effectuating its history one more time. This is how the sociability of art can become once again a kind of knowledge of art that presses forward rather than being stuck in mere indeterminate whimsy. Rigorous art of tomorrow must be about bridging the gap between sciences and humanities on the humanities side of the divide. This is also like a major argument. The cognitive turn and the sort of like rationalist turn kind of like rushing all these artists to become scientists or like learn science, or as if they're going to somehow catch up with what scientists have been doing, right? So even though part of what I see as what is needed is understanding of how sciences work, but our work at the end of the day happens where in the side of the manifest image. We're on this side of we're in this side of a Salarsian divide, if you want to like take his model, right? So rigorous art of tomorrow must be about bridging the gap between the sciences and humanities on the humanities side of the divide. Specifically, I'm thinking of art as a deep science of the unity and interaction of the surfaces of thought, imagination, and the natural or constructed surfaces of the world. The artificiality and synthetic nature of the surface of art can precisely be aligned with the artificiality of pure thought. Thought as an open source, as a collectivity, as a collectively produced synthetic thing itself, and the surface can also be this collectively produced synthetic thing, synthetic surface, as a constitution of form, as an epistemological and constitutive mark of gesture. So here, a note is needed, and that is sort of like any discussion of surface immediately make the audience conflate surface with flatness, and flatness with what we already know from modern art and Greenberg, and go like, oh, is this a return to modernity, or is this a return to a kind of Greenbergian understanding? Whereas I prefer to use the word surface because in a way it demystifies the concept of form and it kind of secularizes it. Why? Because form usually suggests content, whereas surface suggests superficiality or emptiness of form. So immediately by moving from form to surface, you kind of like point to the hollowness of form. So in a way, this is sort of like, this is my preference for the word surface than form is, first of all, doing away with the accusation of formalism, because as you see, I'm not endorsing any kind of formalism. And also do away with sort of like describing form as a hollow thing. So this surface is kind of like morphological, it's topological. It's more like how surfaces work in a video game. in sort of like 3D animation, where you first design all your surfaces, you mold it, and then you apply the surfaces on it, right? That's how most sort of like animation software that makes all these great movies or like games work, right? Actually, an artist whose work I really like these days is John Gerard, who's been kind of like his practice involved this type of like rigorous photography of sites, and then like a careful study of the surface of these real sites by developing sort of like a animated version of all the 3D objects, and then getting other computer artists to produce the actual surfaces to its like crazy realist sense. When from a distance you look at it and you're totally looking at the video, and then you have to really get close and you realize these are all constructed environments. So that type of surface is what I'm thinking. Sort of like this, but also surface as sort of like this thing in between the actual physical materiality of the work and the human or non-human observer or viewer who's on the other side and is sort of like trying to access it. Sort of this membrane between the two. And that's why I find this much more useful to use the word surface than form. Consequently, art is not the production of knowledge, but the production of knowledge effects. We are modifying, ramifying the limits and possibilities of how we know what we know. But for any of this to even begin to take place, first of all, the art of tomorrow needs to be freed from the shackles of the logic of the history of art, but particularly the thick, short chain that leashes it to the logic of the history of modern art. And second, it needs to be freed from the slaving for free as the purveyor of meaning, which itself is a duty expected from art as a consequence of the logic of its modern history. This double liberation from history and from the type of meaning production expected from it, that is from sort of like expectations from that history, if you agree with that history, this double liberation does not require the re-elaboration of the significance of art, and contrary, is a form of downgrading rather than elevation. This is what we were talking about in the email, right? These two conditions are needed if we are going to secularize art from its domination by humanity. This task must begin with asking ourselves, this task is not a shallow task or a shallow question. We have to ask ourselves, under what conditions visual arts have historically become so important to the Western culture? This is a very important, to even begin to liberate yourself, you have to understand what happened in the history of art, why painting and why plastic art became important and sort of like embedded in the idea of philosophy in the Western history. This is an important thing that art has not been able to sort of like really critically examine. It's always sort of like a plus on the art side. Philosophers have always been interested in us. We are so important. Almost like it's like a way of finding legitimacy rather than critically examining the root of this obsession of Western philosophy with plastic forms, right? And this has to really be done if art wants to liberate itself from that history of modern art. Our question then will require us to rewrite the history of the rise of art's significance in relation to the history of thought and philosophy in the West, giving our technologies their proper place in the narrative of the art's life from the prehistoric ages all the way to our own time. How much time do we have? Because I have more to read, but I think I've spoken more, right? I've spoken an hour. Okay, that's pretty good. However, art cannot completely rid itself of meaning for a while until the emergence of a true atheism that not only negates God, but also the visualization of, but also the vitalization of nature, human, material universe, language, and finally, the machine itself. Until then, we have to try our best to ensure that artists aren't the ones intending direct meaning and producing it through producing art. Art's incision from its history and ontology is a particular separation, one that only loosens its ties to its human past so it can invent itself in the present towards its machinic future. by positing the truth in the future, art can maintain its negative conditions of skepticism while at the same time focusing on the positive condition of constructing new perspectives. Building a new purpose for art in the 21st century begins by downgrading art to a rigorous science of surface as the smallest component of what in aesthetic theory is referred to as form. What is form if not the interaction and overlaying of multiple surfaces? What is form if not the form which the multiplicity of surface effects places on the surface of our perception? Being the science of the surface means art has to come to terms with its metaphysical deficit and to be creative with its limited superficial resources. This rigorous science of surface is the essential component for the construction of the stereoscopic vision of art and science, envisioned by Sellars and all the Sellarsian philosophers. It involves taking away art's metaphysical credit cards and forcing it to be resourceful with its own ontology. This is the first step in the long road for art to truly become the form of thought. Maybe we should end it here. Yeah, there's about 3 or 4 more pages, but I think I ended in a good note. Yeah, and sorry if it took too long. Because I think you said it's about an hour and a half for the discussion and the paper, and I don't want to dominate the discussion section because I think there's a lot to discuss, and I want to be able to answer questions too.
You want to sit?
Yeah, that would be lovely. I'm also going to stop the recording.